I convinced myself that my voice wasn't important, that my stories weren't worth telling, that my past defined me. And trauma has a way of doing that, of making us believe that we are unworthy and that our pain is too much. And it keeps us, I think, stuck where we are. I believe that no matter where you are in life, that your story, even if it is unfinished, there's still time. Welcome to the first episode of Unfinished Stories Next Chapter. I'm Stephanie Essery, and I can't tell you how excited I am to finally be here, sitting down to talk to all of you. And for those listening, I want to say thank you. And whether you've stumbled upon this by chance or you've been waiting for me to start sharing, I am so glad that you're here. If you have ever felt like you have unfinished dreams, unfinished business, unfinished stories, or that your life has just taken so many unexpected turns that you barely recognize where you are now, this podcast will be for you. It's going to be about stories, about real stories, creative stories, those stories we left unfinished. Because if we were honest with ourselves, I think that we could admit that we all have something unfinished or something that we really want to accomplish before we leave this world. For myself, that's been writing. For over 40 years, I have written very privately, but for most of my life, I didn't share them with a lot of people, except for those that are closest to me. And it's really taken me over 4 decades, which I know really ages me, but 4 decades to be able to give myself the permission to do what I've always loved. So if you're someone who's ever felt like you've missed your chance or that maybe you feel your dreams belong to someone else, I think this podcast is for you because I understand that feeling all too well. For years, I really silenced myself. I convinced myself that my voice wasn't important, that my stories weren't worth telling, that my past defined me. And trauma has a way of doing that, of making us believe that we are unworthy and that our pain is too much. And it keeps us, I think, stuck where we are. And it really chains us to these old versions of ourselves, to survival patterns that really don't serve us, to the idea that our dreams are just too far gone or just too big for us. And I allowed myself to live in that space for a very long time. But when you've lived over half a century, I think you learn a little something. And I did learn something that really changed everything for me. And that was really recognizing that our stories aren't just about where we've been, they're about where we are going. And sometimes to really be able to move forward, we have to go back first, to revisit our past, to really understand the patterns of our lives and the decisions that we've made, to be able to map out a way forward. And that's something that I had to do, and I've had to do often. And in some ways, it's something I'm still doing. And I want to share with you why that particular path has led me to where I'm at, why I'm starting this podcast, and why I believe that no matter where you are in life, that your story, even if it is unfinished, there's still time. So grab a cup of coffee, let's settle in and get started. First of all, this is not my first time in front of a microphone. Despite the fact that in my 20s, I grappled with severe social anxiety. I could not look you in the eyes. I would walk around with my head down. And even though I had started going to college to study communications, I wanted to be a journalist. I lasted only a year before I quit because it was really difficult for me to stand in front of a class and speak, let alone a larger group of people. So something that I really wanted, I fear I really kept me in not being able to move forward. So when I was finally able to do that, it was in 2019. That was a long ways away from when I started college back in 1989 and 1990. But I finally decided to start a podcast. I wanted to reach out to people in the second half of their life. And in fact, that podcast was called Second Half Success Secrets. And with it, I recorded over, I believe, 55 episodes, and I shared stories of people who were essentially reinventing themselves in the second half of their life. And during the course of that, probably when I was about 40 episodes in of that podcast, I decided to start another podcast, and that one was focused on real estate. I've been in real estate since 1997, so it was something I felt really comfortable in talking about. And what most people didn't know was the reasons behind why I started the podcast and actually had even started a blog at that time. And it was a challenge to myself. I wanted to put myself out there in ways I had never done before. And deep down, I hoped that when I was able to do that, I would be able to build the courage to begin sharing my own creative work and ultimately to take the steps to become a published author. And for me, writing has always been such a huge part of my world. It was something that I kept very private because it was so important to me. But turning it outward for others to see was really terrifying for me. So I started in a space where I felt most familiar with real estate and in helping others with business because I felt like because I had been in the industry so long, that I did have knowledge and that I was a little bit more confident. I figured if I had to step outside of my comfort zone, at least I could do it in a space where I did have some confidence and where I felt I had something to contribute. So it was a safe way to start practicing my vulnerability without really completely feeling exposed. But despite my best efforts, I found myself holding back. I still felt like I was hiding. I did not feel strong enough or comfortable enough talking about anything outside of business. I could talk about business reinvention. I could talk about helping others tell their stories, but I wasn't sharing mine, not fully at that time. And maybe it was just because it wasn't time yet. And then everything while I was in the midst of doing my podcasting journey, which I will say I loved, everything started to change. I had to end up taking emergency custody of my niece and nephew, and they were just 4 years old and 9 months old at the time. Even though I have 5 children, 3 of my children were grown. I had one in college at the time, and then the two that were left at home were in 8th grade and 5th grade. So I thought that I was beyond those early years. And so when my niece and nephew came to live with us, I think you could imagine just the chaos of having young kids in the space again and how that really disrupted what we had going on. Although I do think of them as being a blessing. And during this time, or not long after that, COVID ended up shutting everything down. And which in itself was something that we had to try to manage. The kids all went virtual. So we had children that were going to school in 8th grade and 5th grade. And my nephew started kindergarten, and I had to sit beside him every day. So it was a lot to juggle, a lot more than I was used to at the time. And if life was not chaotic enough, I decided to partner with my brother to open a branch of his construction business in Texas. And suddenly I found myself running a business, raising 4 kids that ranged from 15 years old down to not even a year old, and trying to keep everything afloat. And I realized during that time that something had to give. And ultimately, it was me. And I think that part of that reason is because as long as I can remember, I have been a chronic people pleaser. It's a survival mechanism I think I developed early in life. When you grow up in chaos in an environment where keeping the peace meant keeping yourself safe, you say yes to a lot and you really don't know how to say no. I learned during that time to disappear, how to make myself small. I took on responsibilities that I should have never taken on. And so for a long time, I thought that's just who I was. I was the person who existed to make everybody else's life easier, to do the things that maybe others couldn't do. I felt like it was my responsibility to make sure people were comfortable. And that is not really conducive to being in the construction business. I will tell you that. I ended up needing to say no a lot of times to both clients and to contractors, and I didn't. I was wrapped into doing things that were outside of my scope of what I should have been doing because during all of this, kind of the chaos and everything that happened after COVID, my partner ended up stepping away more, and I was left to do these things on my own. So it was definitely a recipe for disaster, and I really struggled with it. I will tell you that the construction business, even though I had a background in it, I'd been in real estate a long time. It was just something going out into the field and having to take on jobs physically. It was really just too much. I think the hardest job I ever had, and it drained me mentally, physically, financially, and I will tell you it nearly broke me. And I mean that in the most real way possible. I think if I hadn't stepped away when I did, I honestly think that I wouldn't be here. I believe that. I pushed myself and my body to a point where it began shutting down on me. And I got sick, really sick. But I kept going. I convinced myself that stopping would mean failure, that if I let go, I'd be proving everyone that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't capable, and that I was just as small and insignificant as I had always feared that I was. So I had to let go of that business. I had to recognize that it wasn't a failure, it was survival. And in doing so, and being able to admit to myself that I could not do this alone, it was not what I had set out to do. It was not what I had envisioned it to be. And I had to do it to save my life. And not long after that, my niece and nephew ultimately went back home to their mom. And my husband's job ended up changing at around the same time that we ended up having to make a decision as to whether or not we wanted to continue with that business. We decided that he was going to go to San Diego. His job wanted to transfer him there. And initially, it was supposed to be something short term, but ultimately, it lasted a lot longer. And I had to make a decision if we wanted to move with him or if we were going to continue to stay at home. So we decided, because of the medical things that I was going through, that it was best if we were together. I moved there, and my youngest moved there. And my daughter, who was then in high school, decided to finish out her senior year with my son and his wife at home. And making that decision was very difficult. Moves are never easy. But looking back, I realized that it forced a reset in my life that I desperately needed. And honestly, I think that there is no better place to rediscover yourself than by the ocean. San Diego is not a bad place to be. The weather is beautiful. The temperatures are amazing. It's actually, I think, what my body physically needed. And I spent a lot of time on that beach and on the beaches, just watching the waves, just listening to them crash against the shore. We've watched a lot of sunsets, just breathing in that fresh salt air. And I felt during that time that something shifted. And for the first time in a long time, I started to feel like me again. And with that, there was this creative part of me, that storyteller, that came back to life. And I started writing again. And I wasn't just writing, I was creating. I wasn't writing to survive. I was creating, picking up and creating these worlds where I was creating people and places and circumstances that sometimes mirrored the things that I had went through, but had some type of resolution to it. And I just really started to feel something with writing that I had not felt in a very long time. And I'll tell you that writing has been one of the most consistent things in my life. When everything else felt really uncertain, when I questioned whether I should even be here, writing kept me here. It helped me make sense of the world, of myself, of the things that I had survived. And yet, having to step into a space as a writer, a real writer, publicly and openly has been, I knew that I had the skill. I've always been told by teachers or others that have read my work, the very few that I allowed to, that I did have a skill, that I should write more. And even though I was encouraged to do that, I would let fear seep in. And that fear was that if I truly put my work out there, I might learn that the one thing I loved doing above all else was not good enough, that I was not good enough. And that thought was not just terrifying, it was unbearable. I chose more often to write in private, to keep those stories to myself rather than risk them being torn apart. And because writing had kept me through some of the darkest moments of my life, it was the one thing I believed that I might have a gift for. And even saying this out loud feels a little funny saying it, but what would I do if I found out that I didn't? I'm learning to push past that voice, to try to trust in the stories that I have to tell, to believe that they matter. And that's been a really difficult thing to navigate. I do want to share that my first novel, the one that is going to be my debut novel, one that I resurrected, that had started writing in different parts of my life. I placed it in San Diego and finished it here in San Diego. And that novel is going to be my debut novel. The Language of Dreams is it's an exploration of extraordinary ways our minds go to protect us from trauma, and how sometimes when they do that, they also keep us from fully stepping into the life and that we're meant to live. And at its heart, I think this story is about that delicate balance that exists between self preservation and self discovery. And the main character, Alana, she's a journalist, and she spent the last couple of years rebuilding a life after surviving a devastating accident that nearly took her life. And on the surface, she feels that she succeeded in doing just that. She has a seemingly perfect boyfriend, a supportive family. She has a thriving career. And she tells herself that she's healed, that she's moved forward. But I think we all can recognize that healing is rarely that simple. So she begins experiencing these very vivid dreams and these visions of place and people in a love story that she can't explain. She doesn't know who they are, or she's never been to any of these places, yet she still feels very deeply connected to it. And so she's forced to confront a truth that she's really buried, that these dreams are not just figments of her imagination, they are messages. They're fragments of something that's unresolved within her. And the deeper she delves into this, the more she recognizes that her mind has not only shielded her from painful truth, but it's done so at the cost of keeping her from truly living her life. And her journey leads us to a startling revelation that her past and her trauma and her future are all intertwined in ways that she never imagined. So as she pieces this all together, these little mysteries, she finds herself drawn to this other family who was part of the accident, and specifically to the husband of a woman who did not survive it. So what begins as this attempt to make peace with the past turns into something much different. And so she takes on this unfinished work of the woman who lost her life, stepping into a story that's not hers, but it feels like something she was always meant to do. And in doing that, she not only honors what was lost, but also begins to uncover her own true path. And the novel is also about memory, about what we choose to remember, what we unconsciously bury, and the things that those stories and those pieces of our lives and pieces of us that refuse to stay forgotten. It's a story about love, about grief, about invisible threads that bind us to people and places, even some that we've never consciously known. But most of all, it's a story about having the courage to face our deepest wounds and to challenge these narratives we tell ourselves and to embrace the life that we're truly meant to live. And I am incredibly proud of this story. Like I said, I've been writing since I was 12 years old. And that first story that I remember writing about a journalist, and she was involved in a missing girl case and starts to investigate it and see this missing girl everywhere and no one believes her. But I wrote that story because I was so into Nancy Drew novels and the Hardy Boys. I really loved it. And it was a simple story, and it's something that I physically don't have anymore, but I remember very vividly. And this story means so much to me, and that it is a love note to that young girl that I was, that had those big dreams. And there's lots of things within it that are reflections of my life, things that I have experienced, people that I've known. And so it was exactly the story I think that I needed to put out there first. So I took a really huge step in finishing it, but also handing it over to a developmental editor. And while I was really excited to do that, I felt, oh, I have finally done this. I have finally accomplished this. And it was such an amazing feeling, but it was also one of the scariest things that I have ever done. Because if I'm being honest, I'd been wrestling with this imposter syndrome ever since, because she has probably seen a lot of books. The market itself is overflowing with talent. There are thousands of brilliant voices, and so many of them are skilled and younger writers. And they all seem to know exactly where they're doing, exactly what they're doing, and exactly where they're going. And that's when those doubts creep in. And I know, and I tell my children this all the time, that you can look at somebody and think that they have everything together, that their lives are perfect. Although logically, I know that. It's very hard to talk myself down from a ledge when I am comparing myself to others, especially with something that's so incredibly important to me. And so I start to fear, am I too old? Is it too late? Do I even belong here? And so I know that a lot of people feel this way, and that fear doesn't just whisper to us that we're not good enough, it screams at us. And it tells us that we have missed our moment and that this is too big for us. And I'm really I am learning to push past that voice. Like I said, these are things that I have talked to my children about all through the years. I'm really good at giving advice. I'm not always great at following my own advice. And that's something that I continue to work on because I really feel I need to trust that the stories that I have to tell, the stories that have been shaped by my experiences, by my perspectives, by all the years that I've lived are worth telling and that they matter. And I've spent years, my life really carrying these stories inside of me. And I almost feel like many of them have just been waiting for their turn, that they resurrect themselves every once in a while and say, hey, remember, you were supposed to tell our story. And that's what's happened with this one, The Language of Dreams. It's just the beginning. And I know that there's a lot more that I have to tell. So that's something that I'm still navigating and I am still working on because I do believe that this story and that many others are meant to be told and that there's more life that's meant to be lived and that it's just really up to us to claim it. And that's the reason that I did resurrect a podcast or create a new podcast because I wanted to create a space and a place that isn't just about documenting my writing journey. It's a space for connection, for honest conversations, not just about the creative process, but about reminding each other that it's never too late to share our stories. And I want to share the highs and lows of my path to publication, the good, the bad, and the truly messy in between. With the Language of Dreams, I've actually chosen a hybrid publishing route. It's the blend of giving me some creative control and still having that industry support. And I thought about traditional publishing. And for myself, after talking to my editor and my publicist and having conversation with others, is that it takes a while. And I don't want to paint a picture that 54 years old is too old, but you really start, especially when you've been sick, you start to look at things differently through the lens of someone approaching the end of their lives. Now, granted, that may come 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and God willing, 40 years from now. I don't know what that is. And I've lost enough people early in my life to recognize that time is not promised to us, and we don't know when the end of our life will come. And so I didn't think I wanted to wait 2, 3, 5 years for the traditional route of publishing. So with this particular novel, I've chosen to do the hybrid, which will get me there quicker than the traditional route would have done. And at the same time, I have several children's books that are actually ready for release, which I will be self-publishing. And I handed off 8 of my stories that I've written through the years for both my children and my grandchildren to an illustrator. And he has done an amazing job of bringing it to life and bringing my vision to life. And I am so excited to be able to share that with the world as well. And so that I'll be sharing a little bit more about that particular journey. And I am just so proud of all of these things that I'm creating, the stories that began many years ago and the ones that kind of came to life during my children's younger years and then my grandchildren. In fact, the book that I will be releasing is one in a series. It's called Leela and Papa's Grand Adventures. I'm Leela instead of Grandma, and my husband is Papa. And it's especially important to me because it's a reflection of how I try to stay connected with my grandchildren despite the distance that we have daily phone calls and video calls. And they're still very young. So my oldest grandchild is 3, and I have 2 that will be 2 in May and in June. And I've really tried to stay connected with them, whether it's on the video calls and we sing and we tell stories and we do all of these things. So that's what this little series is about. And it's just beautifully illustrated. And I cannot wait to share it with the world, especially for grandparents that maybe have struggled with the same things, being a distance away from their grandchildren. And if that isn't enough, I also have another children's book that is called The Golden Thread. That was one I wrote when my children were young. And it's about how those that came before us shape who we are, whether that's through inherited traits or traditions or stories. And that one as well will be releasing around the same time as Leila and Papa's Grand Adventures. And of course, I like to make my life as full and as complicated sometimes as it possibly can be. So I am in the middle of revising another story, another novel that I had that I started quite a while ago. I would say in the early 2000s, late 1990s. And when I picked it up again and I started revising it, I realized that it became a prequel of sorts to The Language of Dreams. It's definitely not the way it started out. It was a completely separate story. It is about the roots, how deep our family roots go and the beauty and imperfect legacies. And it's about a big, loud family in Louisiana, which kind of mirrors my own family in a lot of ways. And I just find it's a beautiful story. But like I said, it started out one way. And then as I stepped deeper in it, it took me somewhere entirely unexpected. And I think that's really the magic and the beauty of writing, that you don't always know where it's taking you, that you think you're leading the story, and then sometimes it leads you. But this podcast is not just going to be about my journey and not just about my creative journey. I want Unfinished Stories Next Chapter to be a space where we can talk not just about the creative process in real and raw moments, but the process in general of taking things that we thought were done, things that we still want to accomplish, but we're scared to do, and making those things happen. So some of these episodes will be solo, like this one, where I'll be sharing my insights, creativity, my life, what it means to rediscover yourself after years of putting your dreams on hold. But I'll also be bringing other guests. These will be writers, dreamers, and people who really faced setbacks and still found a way to keep going. I've invited not just authors who have had a similar path to publication like myself, but others who have navigated change in their lives and ended up being able to overcome trauma and get out of their own way and be able to accomplish the things that they thought at some point in their life that they'd never be able to do. So I'm really excited to bring these conversations to you all and to introduce you to people who have built something for nothing and who have faced self-doubt but kept going anyway. At its core, I hope that this podcast is going to be about pushing past fear, the fear that tells us we're not good enough, that we're not talented enough or young enough or ready. It's about embracing imperfection and understanding that our stories, no matter how long they may take to tell, are worth telling. And I hope that I am able to encourage you to honor your own story, to trust the process of life and the process of what you're navigating, even when it feels uncertain, and to remind you that the path to anything meaningful is rarely a straight line. Whether you're a writer or an artist or someone that's simply longing to step into a dream that you've put on hold for way too long, I hope that this podcast can remind you that it's never too late, because there are not failures. Your story is just waiting for the next chapter. So I want to thank you all so much for listening, for sharing this moment with me. I am so incredibly excited about stepping back into this podcasting journey and taking you all along with me. And I want you to know that this isn't always going to be smooth. It's going to get messy sometimes because I am doing this really scared. And with that comes a lot of chaos. I am navigating some very uncharted territories for myself, things that I have avoided doing for a long time and that I've wanted to do more than anything. But I am here. I am embracing the mess. I am facing my fear and stepping into something that I truly believe that I am meant to do. So maybe that's just the beauty of it all, allowing ourselves to be imperfect, to be vulnerable, and to show up anyway. If this podcast resonates with you, I hope that if you found a little bit of yourself in these words, I would love for you to subscribe so that you don't miss what's coming next. And if you feel inclined, leave us a review, because that's going to help us reach even more people who might need to hear the same message. People who need to know that they are not alone in their unfinished journeys. Also, you can connect with me at stephanieessery.com. You'll get all of the links to all of our socials. We're also working on coming forth with a TikTok channel that is going to be more about exploring our children's stories. But I want to remind you that no matter where you're at, what you're dreaming of, what you're struggling with, you can figure out exactly what you need to get your story started. Keep going, even when it's messy, especially when it's messy, because that's where all the real magic happens. Talk to you next time.